Mayor of Tirana, Mr. Aaron Veljaj, who came to that place as a leading activist in one very big people's movement that was very successful in Albania. Can you share that experience with us and also some information about the situation concerning environmental protection in Tirana?
Thank you very much. On that last remark, I will confess from the get-go, it's much easier to overthrow a government than to build one. So I'm witnessing from experience that it takes a lot more effort and patience to build a system or a city that is sustainable than to rally against a government you don't like. But I remember this great quote from President Lyndon Johnson. After the civil strife and after he retired from the presidency, he was approached by a journalist, I think in maybe a similar panel, and the question was, how did you feel, or how did you, give courage to yourself in those very tough days of the civil strife after President Kennedy was assassinated, when there were protests everywhere, the United States was on fire? How did you deal with it? And he'd say, I'd look myself in front of a mirror and I'd say, Lyndon, cheer up, you could have been mayor. So I think there's probably an encouragement for many people that the job of a mayor is clearly one of the most fascinating, but also one of the most tough ones, because you're constantly dealing with pressure and having to respond to multitasking and emergencies all the time. But since we were all recalling our communist past, it looks like instead of an environmental panel, this was a former communist country's mayor's panel. I remember that one of the few movies that was allowed in communist Albania, which of course had very heavy censorship, and I belong to the last generation that remembered the 80s, was this film called Return to the Future. And I think it was 1985 or so, but Return to the Future, they were referring to this very, very far away year, which happened to be last year. So I think not only do we live in very rapidly changing time, and of course for many people we live in a post-truth world, we also live in a post-future world. And I think to what seemed very distant to me as a child in 1985, it's clearly the past now. And I think it's very important to keep that in mind. And jokes aside, let me give you a few statistics. I grew up in a city which is the capital of Albania that for reasons that religion was prohibited, private property was prohibited. So that means also cars were prohibited. In 1990 when Albania opened up, the whole city had 200,000 people and 17 cars, which was the high-ranking military and also the high-ranking Politburo members. Today, the city has 1 million people, fivefold, and 170,000 cars in the very same identical space that the city was designed for. So I think many mayors face challenges that, most of us, or most of you actually, would find mind-boggling. But I think, unlike researchers or analysts that can spend endless time thinking solutions, mayors have to respond extremely fast. I remember this one famous joke about how to solve complex issues. There was this one rabbit in a forest. It was extremely scared and running away from being eaten up by other animals. So one day he goes to see his friends and he says, look, I cannot live my life with fear and paranoia. I have to find a solution for this. So the other animals said, look, you have to see the owl. He went to Harvard, he worked for the OSBE-së, he's an expert. So he'll tell you what to do. So he goes to see the owl and he says, look, I'm the bottom of the food chain. I cannot live my life with fear. Give me a solution. What should I do? And the owl thinks, fixes his glasses and he says, I have a solution for you. I think you should become a lion. Because if you become a lion, you're the top of the food chain. No one wants to eat you. And you cannot live the rest of your life with fear. So there's a solution. So the rabbit is very happy. He says, thank you so much. I never thought of this. I have one follow-up question. How do I become a lion? And then the owl says, my friend, look, I'm in charge of strategic thinking, not project implementation. That you have to do on your own. And I think most mayors have to do this stuff on their own. And by the time expertise comes with no means or financial instruments on how to deliver, then you have to get really creative. So I'll tell you how we did it in Tirana. I wish we were allowed slides because we had some very fun slides, but you can see some of that stuff online. One day we decided, I think the issue of constituency is very important. Many people mentioned it. The million-dollar question is, who's your constituency? Is it only the people who vote and pay taxes, or everyone? In Tirana, we like to think it's everyone, which means also children. So before we decided that one way to combat pollution, which by the way is killing more people than wars or terrorism, in places that do not suffer from terrorism or have a religious harmony like the one we have in Tirana, then pollution is taking more lives from respiratory diseases than any other violent form of extremism. So we said, well, if we declare spaces of the city entirely without cars, then of course you have a revolution from the 170,000 people who have a car. So we said, well, why don't we try these days without cars? And we call a day off for all the children so they can test it, just like you test a toy, just like you test a car before you buy. So we decided to declare entire parts of the city car-free. And you would not believe the thousands of children that practically invaded all the space in the heart of the city. We did it so many times that most parents were now complaining, not because there was no way for the traffic, but they would say, Mr. Mayor, what have you done? The fleet of bikes and scooters and rollerblades and roller skates and hoverboards that I've had to purchase because of this policy is mind-boggling. My child is becoming a little radical and a little revolutionary in the house. It says, Mayor says the day without cars, so we leave the car, everybody get on a bike. And it's amazing on how a car, which became a status symbol, not only a means of transport, but you come from a very poor country, the North Korea of Europe at the time, and now owning a car also showed that you had moved up with status, that you were somebody in life, you had earned enough wealth to purchase your car. And how do we change this? By the power of children, who can be some of the, like Santa's little helpers. A mayor's little helpers are always children who are open to ideas and who are open to change. Now, I see some of you are smiling, but the idea of change is very exciting and very sexy when you hear about it, but not when you implement it. When you run for office and you ask people in a room like this, it says, who wants change? Everybody raises their hand. I want change, I want change. But then when you come in office and you ask people, who wants to change? And everybody says, no, I'll have her change first. And her second, I will change last. So change is not easy to implement unless, like in Tirana, you get creative. Now we're finishing a big project, Skanderbeg Square, for those who've been in Tirana, which will be the largest pedestrian area in Eastern Europe almost, of any urban territory. It was a very bold decision, now with very little resistance, but in the beginning it was almost an impossible project for several mayors, simply because the hysteria involved about making some very bold decisions included mostly taxpayers and voters, but not necessarily the entire constituency, which sometimes includes non-voters and non-taxpayers, like children. We also decided to call our value system into question. Are we building cities for cars, or are we building cities for people? Because if cars had a personality, a car would like to be alone, to have a free lane, to not be with other cars. But people are not cars. People like to be with other people. That's why we sit in panels like this. That's why you sit in chairs next to friends and colleagues and other people you work with. So I think once you call this question, this value into question, then you start designing a city for people. So not only we declared a lot of the space car-free, and now we just opened a new bazaar, another big area that has been declared car-free, but we started to see some of the early results. And I think in policy or in government, there's some low-hanging fruit, which you can collect easy with some simple changes. And this was exactly that. We saw that only in our first year, air pollution dropped by 15%, because it gave the city the space to breathe. And then we asked the second question. For 25 years, the value of capitalism was to get a car. So now we said, well, what is our value now? Is it for every poor person to eventually make enough money in order to buy a car? Or is it that to build a public transport system so good that rich people get on a bus? And I think for the first time we started some of the most transformative reforms in our public transport system. Not only adding 50% of our bus fleet, but making longer routes. So now with the same price, you could go up to 14 kilometers across the city with one single ticket. And I think it gave people the freedom to understand that this is not a sacrilege, we can change, and it actually can be a lot of fun. So now we do these traditional days without cars almost every month. And if there's a month that was too cold, I immediately get the early protest that says, Mr. Mayor, you know, how did you forget a day without car? Usually from the very same people who were protesting us having the days without cars in the very beginning. Also, for the first time, we said we got to put our money where our mouth is. Of course, we're a poor country, we're a developing country. Of course, we've had haphazard urbanization in 25 years, where people pretty much built just about anywhere they could. But now we said, why don't we make some very bold decisions? We worked with architect Stefano Boeri, who came up with a great concept called Bosco Verticale in Milan, which is the vertical forest, building residences that can, that can have a sustainability that will withhold climate change. And then we said, well, why don't we take the same concept for the cities? So we decided for Tirana, for the first time in our new urban plan, to build something not called vertical forest, but orbital forest. And why do we say for the first time in history, rather than making this really token planting of trees that a mayor with a shovel takes a picture, why don't we make a very bold move and we put a few million euros towards planting 2 million trees to surround the cities in some sort of a green belt that also signals a departure from the old system of putting concrete and asphalt everywhere, but also creating some sort of a boundary. Why do we need that boundary? I'll give you one example. Every day in Tirana, our local register in the city hall says 50 people move their residency from the provinces to the city. So now we're becoming a city of 1 million people, the capital, in a country of 3 million people total. And eventually we're becoming a city-state almost with these types of departures. Now, that we cannot stop. Someone asked me in my first year, I've been in the job a year and a half, and he said, Mr. Mayor, how does it feel to be a mayor for a year? And I said, well, it's great, it's a great job. I manage everybody's plan B. I said, what do you mean everybody's plan B? Well, I said, if you live in an Albanian province, plan A, I have a friend from Italy here, Secretary General, plan A is to go to the West, Italy or Germany. If you don't, plan B is go to the capital. So I manage everybody's plan B, those who didn't go far away but came to the capital. So I think whether it's plan A, B, or C, I think, like Lyndon Johnson said, it's probably one of the most difficult jobs, but also one of the most exciting jobs. You asked about my past in civil society, and I honestly can say, not only as a punchline, that it's much, much easier to criticize and help mobilize what you're against for. It's much more difficult to help mobilize people what you're in favor of. And I think sometimes in the era we live today, with the abundance of fake news and hysteria, I think it's very important to communicate, but not only to communicate to your traditional constituency, but to also involve some unusual advocates of the city, which sometimes can be little children. Thank you.
Wow. This was an excellent presentation. And as you could see and hear, with a little visionary thinking and a lot of energy, you can easily turn from red to green. And now, turning to our last panelist, Mrs. Anna Vasilace, who is very renowned. Do you need any help? Okay. Very renowned in the field of battling the corruption. We will hear a lot about what are the islands of integrity from her and what should we do as mayors, as public figures, and as a representative of civil society in order to do our jobs in the most effective way.
Thank you. So I like very much what you said about it's easy to demolish and it's very difficult to build, because my background is architecture, so I know how difficult it is to plan and build something. And also being for 20 and more years founder and executive director of a Romanian NGO called Partners Foundation for Local Development, our approach was always not to criticize but to support local governments, if, of course, they want to change and they really mean this. So the anti-corruption methodology that we called Islands of Integrity was born, inspired, and in collaboration with a famous mayor, the mayor of La Paz, Ronald Maclina Baroa, who wrote a very, very interesting book together with his consultant, Professor Robert Lidgard, which is called Corrupt Cities, A Practical Guide to Cure and Prevent. And we developed it in a 12-year collaboration, so we now have disseminated the methodology in more than 30 local governments and 12 countries in our region. But first, when I encountered his fantastic experience, which is one of the rarest successful anti-corruption experience in this world, I read his book. And this book, you know, there are books who change your life. This book changed my life. I received it by chance. I was in the World Bank Institute in a course, and a lady came with a pile of books, and I said, give me one of these books to read it when I go home, because I have a long flight till Bucharest. And when I read it, I realized for the first time that this kind of approach, we can replicate it in our region also. So then, because we already had like a network of trainers, facilitators, that we build their capacity, we collaborated also with UN Habitat Training and Capacity Building Department. So we had this